Picture a quiet farm in the heart of Wisconsin, surrounded by endless fields and silence. The kind of place where life seems simple, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But behind those weathered walls, investigators would uncover something so unsettling that even the most seasoned officers struggled to put it into words. They found masks stitched from human skin, furniture covered in remains, and skulls repurposed as household objects. And at the center of this nightmare stood a man who, to his neighbors, seemed almost ordinary, Ed Gein. The most haunting question was not just what he did, but how someone so unassuming could become the inspiration for some of cinema's most unforgettable figures. His case would later echo through Hollywood, shaping Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lamb. Yet the reality was far darker than any script. What makes this story even more chilling is a lesser-known detail. Despite the grotesque discoveries inside his farmhouse, the number of confirmed incidents tied directly to him was surprisingly small. The terror was not in the count, but in the transformation of grief and obsession into something that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Imagine stepping into that farmhouse, the air heavy, the silence broken only by the creak of the floorboard. Every corner revealed something more disturbing than the last, each object whispering of a mind consumed by loss and fixation. It was not just an investigation, it was a descent into a world where death had been reshaped into craftsmanship. This is why Ed Gein's story continues to fascinate and horrify decades later. It is not about numbers, but about the unsettling truth that sometimes the most terrifying figures hide behind the most ordinary faces. If you're drawn to real cases that change the way we see horror forever, stay with this journey, because sometimes the scariest monsters are not born in fiction, but in plain sight. Long before the world would know his name, Ed Gein's life was already unfolding in shadows. Picture this: a lonely farmhouse on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin. The year is 1906. Inside those walls, a boy is born into a world that will never feel quite right. His mother, Augusta Gein, ruled that house like a fortress against sin. She was fiercely religious, convinced that nearly every woman on earth was corrupt, that the world outside was a cesspool of wickedness waiting to swallow her sons whole. Day after day, she filled young Ed's mind with sermons about damnation, about the rottenness of human nature, about divine punishment lurking around every corner. Can you imagine being that child, hearing those words over and over until they became the only truth you knew? His father existed more as a ghost than a parent, lost in bottles, absent even when present. His older brother tried desperately to break free from that suffocating atmosphere. But Ed seemed to sink deeper and deeper into his mother's gravitational pull. While other children laughed on playgrounds and formed friendships, Ed remained trapped on that isolated farm, cut off from society, his mind drifting into strange, dark fantasies that no one else could see. Then came the losses that would reshape everything. First, his father passed away. Years later, during a brush fire on their property, Ed's brother died under circumstances that still raise questions today. Some whispered that Ed might have been involved, though nothing was ever proven. The truth died with the flames that day, but the death that would truly shatter him was still to come. When Augusta died in 1945, Ed Gein lost the only person who had ever mattered to him. He was alone now, completely, utterly alone in that creaking farmhouse. And here's what most people don't know. In the months after his mother's death, neighbors reported seeing lights moving through the farmhouse windows late at night, heard Ed talking to someone inside, carrying on full conversations in empty rooms. Something inside him had fractured. The boy who'd been molded by fear and obsession was gone. What remained was something else entirely. And within those walls, sealed off from the world, things were beginning to happen that no one could have imagined. Not yet, but they would. Soon enough, they would. After his mother's passing, Ed Gein became something of a ghost himself. The people of Plainfield would describe him the same way over and over again. Strange, yes, but polite. Harmless. He'd show up to do odd jobs for neighbors, help out on nearby farms, fix a fence here, move some hay there. To all appearances, he was just another lonely man living out his days in quiet isolation. But what no one could see was what happened when the sun went down. As darkness settled over that farmhouse each night, Gein would retreat into the world inside his mind, a world that was beginning to twist into something unrecognizable. He became consumed with reading, not novels or newspapers, but medical texts about anatomy, accounts of wartime experiments, and most disturbingly, detailed descriptions of grave exhumation. The townspeople didn't notice at first. How could they? But then something strange started happening in the cemeteries around Plainfield. Groundskeepers would arrive in the morning to find freshly disturbed earth where there should have been none. Headstones shifted slightly, the ground around certain graves sunken in, as if something beneath had been removed. Families began to whisper. Graves were being violated. Bodies were disappearing. But no one could imagine who, or what, was responsible. The truth was far more chilling than anyone suspected. Under cover of darkness, Ed Gein was slipping into those cemeteries with a shovel and a lantern. He would carefully dig down to recently buried coffins, pry them open, and remove what he needed. Then he'd carry the remains back to his isolated farm, where no one would ever think to look. But here's the part that makes this case truly disturbing, the part that still haunts investigators who studied it decades later. He wasn't collecting these remains for any reason most people could comprehend. Gein was trying to create what he called a second skin using parts of human bodies. He genuinely believed that if he could stitch together enough pieces, he could somehow physically transform himself into his own mother, the one person who had ever held power over his shattered mind. It sounds like something out of a horror film, but it was real, and it was happening night after night in that farmhouse, in total secrecy. Then the case took an even darker turn. Investigators would later discover that Gein wasn't limiting himself to cemeteries. And when a woman from town vanished without a trace one November morning, the quiet man from the edge of Plainfield was about to become the center of one of the most shocking investigations in American history. November 1957. A hardware store in Plainfield sits empty on a Saturday morning. The door is unlocked. The register is open. But the owner, Bernice Worden, is nowhere to be found. Her son arrives to check on her and immediately knows something is wrong. The silence feels heavy, unnatural. He notices the store's sales receipt book lying open on the counter. The last name written down, Ed Gein. Within hours, law enforcement is heading toward that isolated farmhouse on the edge of town. They have no idea they're about to step into something that will redefine the boundaries of human darkness. Picture the scene, a cold Wisconsin evening, the sun already setting behind bare trees. Officers approach the weathered barn, flashlights cutting through the growing shadows. The door creaks open, and what they see in that first moment will haunt them for the rest of their lives. There, suspended from the rafters, is Bernice Worden's body, displayed in a way that defies comprehension, treated not as a person, but as something else entirely. One officer turns away, hand over his mouth. Another stands frozen, unable to process what his eyes are telling him. But that discovery is only the beginning. Nothing, not their years of training, not their experience, not any case they'd ever worked, could prepare them for what waited inside the farmhouse. They push open the door to the main house. The smell hits them first. Then, as their flashlights sweep across the rooms, the true scope of horror reveals itself piece by piece. Chairs upholstered with something that isn't leather. Masks hanging on the walls that aren't made of rubber or cloth. Bowls fashioned from skulls, positioned casually on shelves as if they were ordinary kitchenware. A shoebox filled with human remains, stored like keepsakes. And in one room they find what Gein called his suit, an entire garment stitched together from preserved human skin, complete enough that someone could wear it. The officers begin to understand. This isn't just a crime scene, it's a workshop, a place where death had been transformed into craft, where the boundary between person and object had been completely erased. Several officers rush outside and get sick. Others refuse to go back in, their hands shaking as they try to light cigarettes in the November cold. The world is about to meet the real Ed Gein. But here's what makes this case even more deeply unsettling, a detail that investigators would struggle to reconcile. Despite the overwhelming horror discovered inside that farmhouse, despite the dozens of items fashioned from human remains, the official count of confirmed incidents directly attributed to him was remarkably small. Only 2. Just 2. And that might be the most disturbing part of all. Because the terror of this case wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in what came after, in the obsessive collection, in the meticulous preservation, in the transformation of the deceased into objects for daily use. This wasn't about the act itself. It was about what his mind had become in the years of isolation, grief, and delusion. It was about a psyche so fractured that it had created an entirely different relationship with death. For the investigators standing in that farmhouse, flashlights trembling in their hands, one thing became clear. They weren't just documenting evidence. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of a mind that had long ago stopped seeing the world the way the rest of us do. And as news of the discovery began to spread beyond Plainfield, something unexpected started to happen. Writers in Hollywood began taking notes. Directors started sketching scenes. Because what they found in Ed Gein's farmhouse would soon reshape the horror genre forever, giving birth to some of cinema's most unforgettable figures. But that influence came at a cost. The blurring of a line between entertainment and the very real nightmare that unfolded in rural Wisconsin on that cold November night. The investigation was just beginning, but the impact would echo for generations. When the details of the Gein case finally broke into the public consciousness, something unexpected happened in Hollywood. Writers and directors didn't turn away in horror. They leaned in closer, because what they found in those police reports wasn't just a crime. It was a template for a new kind of terror, one that felt uncomfortably real. The first transformation came just 3 years after Gein's arrest. 1960. Alfred Hitchcock releases Psycho, and audiences meet Norman Bates for the first time. A quiet motel owner, painfully polite, trapped in the psychological grip of his deceased mother, unable to separate himself from her influence even after death. The parallels were unmistakable. Like Gein, Bates lived in isolation, dominated by a maternal figure whose control extended far beyond the grave. Hitchcock had taken the emotional core of the Wisconsin case, the warped mother-son dynamic, the fractured identity, the veneer of normalcy concealing something deeply broken, and channeled it into cinema. But here's what most people don't know. Hitchcock deliberately kept the Gein connection quiet during the film's release. He wanted audiences to believe it was pure fiction, that no one could really be like that. The horror felt safer that way. It wasn't. Years passed. The Gein case faded from headlines, but not from memory. Then came another film, another monster born from the same dark soil. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre arrived in 1974, and with it came Leatherface, a hulking figure hidden behind a mask of human skin, living in a decaying house filled with furniture made from bone and flesh. The filmmakers openly acknowledged the inspiration. They'd read about Gein's farmhouse, about the masks he'd crafted, about the way he'd transformed human remains into household objects. They took that reality and amplified it into something that felt like a fever dream, but the foundation remained chillingly factual. Audiences left theaters shaken, many not realizing they'd just watched a story rooted in real events. But perhaps the most famous echo of Gein's legacy came more than 3 decades after his arrest, 1991. The Silence of the Lambs introduces the world to Buffalo Bill, a figure obsessed with creating a full bodysuit from human skin, believing that transformation would somehow complete him, make him whole. That specific detail, the suit, the obsession with becoming someone else through borrowed skin, came directly from the Gein case files. The investigators who'd found Gein's creation in that farmhouse couldn't have imagined it would one day become a central plot point in an Academy Award-winning film. And here's the haunting irony. Fiction had become the safe way to process a reality too disturbing to confront directly. Hollywood had taken one man's fractured psyche and scattered it across generations of storytelling, each iteration slightly more digestible than the truth, each monster a buffer between audiences and the uncomfortable fact that Ed Gein had actually existed. Reality had proven more terrifying than any screenwriter's imagination. But while moviegoers watched these films from the safety of theater seats, munching popcorn and knowing the credits would eventually roll, one question continued to trouble the psychiatrists, investigators, and legal experts who'd actually studied the case. Who was Ed Gein, really? Was he someone who understood exactly what he was doing, calculated, deliberate, aware of the lines he was crossing? Or was he a man so completely consumed by psychological fracture that he'd lost all connection to shared reality, living in a world where his actions made perfect, terrible sense? The answer mattered. It always mattered. Because if he was the former, he becomes a villain we can categorize, understand, and file away. But if he was the latter, if his mind was so shattered by grief, isolation, and maternal control that he genuinely couldn't perceive the horror of his actions, then he becomes something far more unsettling. He becomes a reminder that the human mind, under the right conditions of trauma and isolation, can drift so far from consensus reality that it creates its own nightmarish logic. And that possibility is more frightening than any movie monster could ever be. Because monsters in films always stay on screen, but fractured minds walk among us, hidden behind ordinary faces, living in quiet houses at the edge of town, their inner worlds invisible until the day someone finally opens the door and looks inside. The interrogation room feels smaller than it should. Ed Gein sits across from detectives, his hands folded calmly on the table. No trembling, no visible distress, just an unsettling quietness. And then he begins to talk. What strikes the officers isn't what he says, though the details are disturbing enough. It's how he says it. The tone is conversational, almost casual, as if he's describing how he fixed a fence or repaired a tractor. There's no emotional register that matches the gravity of his words. One detective later recalls the feeling in that room. It was like talking to someone from a completely different reality. He didn't seem to understand why we were upset. That disconnect would become the central question of the case. Court-appointed psychiatrists spend weeks evaluating Gein, conducting interview after interview, administering test after test. Their conclusion is unanimous and troubling. He suffers from severe psychological disorders that have fundamentally severed his connection to shared reality. He cannot fully comprehend what he's done, not because he's lying or pretending, but because his mind literally doesn't process the world the way a functioning person does. The legal system faces an uncomfortable truth. You cannot try someone who doesn't understand the trial itself. So instead of a courtroom, Gein is sent to a psychiatric institution. For years, he lives there in a strange kind of limbo, neither free nor traditionally imprisoned, existing in the space reserved for those whose minds have gone somewhere the law cannot follow. Decades pass. The world moves on. New cases capture headlines. The farmhouse in Plainfield becomes a dark footnote in true crime history, but the legal questions never fully go away. Eventually, the courts revisit his case. By this point, his mental state has stabilized somewhat, enough that officials determine he can understand legal proceedings. He's formally held responsible for 2 confirmed incidents: Mary Hogan, who disappeared in 1954, and Bernice Worden, whose disappearance finally exposed everything in 1957. Just 2 names on an official record. But investigators who worked the case have always believed the real number might be higher. The problem is proof. Without remains that can be definitively connected to specific missing persons, without witnesses, without confessions that hold up under psychiatric evaluation, the questions remain open. Here's what most people miss about the Gein case, though the detail that separates it from almost every other notorious investigation in American history. What cemented his place in the cultural memory wasn't the body count at all. It was what came after. The systematic desecration, the transformation of human remains into objects of daily life, the complete erasure of the boundary between the living and the dead. That's what people couldn't forget. That's what invaded their nightmares. And then, almost as if the universe itself wanted to close the chapter, something strange happened. A few months after Gein's arrest, that farmhouse, the epicenter of so much horror, the place where investigators had made discoveries that defied comprehension, caught fire. The blaze came in the middle of the night. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late to save the structure. The flames consumed everything: the walls, the rooms, the workshop, every corner where darkness had taken physical form. The official cause was never definitively determined. Some believed it was arson. Locals whispered that someone, maybe a group of townspeople, maybe even law enforcement who couldn't bear the thought of that place standing, had deliberately torched it, trying to erase the building from existence, to wipe away the physical reminder of what had happened there. Others thought it might have been an accident, wiring or debris igniting naturally, but the timing felt too convenient, too symbolic, like the town itself was trying to heal by eliminating the wound. It didn't work. You can burn down a building, but you can't burn down memory. You can't incinerate the way a case changes how people see their neighbors, their small towns, the quiet figures who live at the edges of communities. By the time those flames died down, Ed Gein's name had already been permanently etched into the history of human darkness, not because of numbers, not because of violence alone, but because his case revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the human mind, how it can fracture under the right combination of isolation, trauma, and obsession. How reality itself can become negotiable for someone whose psychological foundation has crumbled. The farmhouse was gone, but the questions it raised would linger for generations. And somewhere in that psychiatric institution, Ed Gein continued living in whatever reality his broken mind had constructed, unreachable by the moral frameworks the rest of us use to make sense of the world. The case was closed, technically, but its echoes would never stop reverberating. July 26, 1984. Inside the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, an elderly man takes his final breath. No family at his bedside, no friends waiting in the hall, just the quiet hum of institutional walls and the distant footsteps of nurses making their rounds. Ed Gein dies the same way he lived his final decades, alone, disconnected, existing in a reality separate from everyone else. He was 77 years old. You might think that would be the end of the story, that his death would finally close the book on one of America's most disturbing cases. But here's the thing about legacies. They don't respect the boundaries of life and death. Gein's shadow continues to stretch across our culture in ways that would have been impossible to predict back in 1957 when investigators first opened that farmhouse door. Think about it. How many figures from criminal history have achieved what he did? Not infamy measured in victim counts or years of terror, but something stranger. A kind of dark immortality through cultural transformation. He wasn't responsible for the highest number of confirmed incidents. Far from it. Just 2 official cases bear his name. He wasn't even the most famous figure during his own lifetime. The media frenzy around his arrest burned hot but relatively brief, especially compared to other notorious cases of that era. So why does his name still carry weight decades later? Why do film students study his influence? Why do psychological profilers still reference his case in their training? Because Ed Gein did something that cuts deeper than numbers ever could. He obliterated the line between reality and nightmare. He took the mundane, a farmhouse, household furniture, everyday objects, and revealed how they could be transformed into vessels of horror. He showed that darkness doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it lives quietly at the edge of town, behind closed doors, in the mind of someone who seems almost ordinary. That realization is more unsettling than any body count could ever be. And here's a detail that often gets overlooked in discussions of his legacy. Gein's case fundamentally changed how we think about the psychology of extreme behavior. Before him, the public imagination divided people into simple categories: good and evil, sane and insane, dangerous and harmless. But Gein existed in all the in-between spaces. He was polite but disturbed, functional in some ways, completely detached from reality in others. He could hold a conversation about the weather while living in a world no one else could see. That complexity, that uncomfortable gray area, became the template for how we now understand psychological fracture in criminal cases. The neat categories stopped working. Decades have passed since that cold November night in Plainfield. Generations have come and gone. The physical evidence has long since been destroyed or locked away in archives. But the question his case raised still lingered, hanging in the air like fog that never quite lifts. How many others might there be? How many fractured minds live behind ordinary faces, working ordinary jobs, existing in quiet corners of ordinary town? How many isolated farmhouses or suburban homes might contain realities we can't begin to imagine until someone finally opens the door? That's the true horror of the Gein legacy. Not what happened in the past, but what it suggests about the present, about the invisibility of profound psychological darkness, about how easily it can hide in plain sight. We pass strangers every day. Most are exactly what they appear to be, but some aren't, and we have no way of knowing which is which until it's too late. That uncertainty, that crack in our sense of safety, is what Ed Gein left behind. Not just a police file or a historical footnote, but a permanent question mark hovering over our assumptions about human nature. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, you understand something important. True crime isn't just about cataloging the past. It's about understanding the present. It's about asking uncomfortable questions and sitting with the fact that sometimes there are no clean answers. The reality of cases like this often proves more disturbing, more complex, and more psychologically intricate than any screenplay could capture. Because fiction has to make sense. Reality doesn't owe us that courtesy. Ed Gein's story reminds us that the most terrifying monsters aren't created by special effects teams or imagination. They're born from isolation, trauma, and the slow dissolution of the boundaries that keep most of us tethered to shared reality. And they can look exactly like the quiet neighbor who waves from across the street.